and have come to do the Lord homage.
Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. After Jesus had been born at Bethlehem in Judea, during the reign of King Herod, some wise men came to Jerusalem from the east. "Where is the infant king of the Jews?" they asked. "We saw his star as it rose and have come to do him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was perturbed, and so was the whole of Jerusalem. He called together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people and inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. "At Bethlehem in Judea," they told him, "for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, you are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you will come a leader who will shepherd my people, Israel." Then Herod summoned the wise men to see him privately. He asked them the exact date on which the star had appeared and sent them on to Bethlehem. "Go and find out all about the child," he said, "and when you have found him, let me know, so that I may go and do him homage." Having listened to what the king had to say, they set out. And there in front of them was the star they had seen rising. It went forward and halted over the place where the child was. The sight of the star filled them with delight. And going into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and falling to their knees, they did him homage. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. But they were warned in a dream not to go back to Herod and return to their own country by a different way. The Gospel of the Lord. You know, the introduction at Mass today, when I wished you all a happy Epiphany, there was a kind of hesitation that we're used to Merry Christmas, we're used to Happy New Year, but Happy Epiphany. There's something being lost in our consciousness about this great feast day. You know, in the Eastern Church, this is Christmas. They don't celebrate Christmas Day. This is the day they celebrate. In the Mediterranean lands, in Italy and in Spain, today is the day that you exchange gifts. Not Christmas Day, today. And the understanding of today is critical to our understanding of Christmas. So, get Epiphany high up there on your agenda. It's really important. And of course, we all know the image of Epiphany. You know, I've been using this particular image on social media, and it would make a good Epiphany card. You know, you see all the elements there. You've got the manger, you've got the star, you've got the three wise men. That's just perfect. It just sums up what Epiphany is all about. Well, I'm going to burst your bubble. You know, because we need to look a wee bit closer at what we hear in the Gospels today. The Gospel begins today after Jesus had been born. Now, I don't know if you've asked yourself the question, how long after Jesus was born did these events take place? You know, because, and maybe it's because the way we celebrate Christmas, everything just happens all at once. You know, that Joseph and Mary make their way to Bethlehem, Mary gives birth to a son, the shepherds turn up, the wise men turn up, and it all just boom, 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 and it's all over, done and dusted in 24 hours. You know, but Scripture scholars suggest that the events of Epiphany that we're celebrating today happened at least months, if not a year after the birth of Jesus. And we can look at the evidence for this. We hear in the Gospels, 8 days after Jesus was born, he was circumcised. So there's a gap already of about a week. 40 days after Jesus was born, Mary was purified after giving birth in accordance to the rites of that time. Then Jesus was taken to the temple and presented to the Lord. And we hear of Anna and Simeon giving praise to God for the great wonders that have taken place. So we can see that there is a time lag already, just in the scriptures. But there's something kind of significant in the gospel today that you probably didn't even hear. And it's this in verse 11 of the Gospel of Matthew, which we have just heard, that they entered into the house. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary and bowed down and worshipped him. A house? That doesn't fit in with Christmas. Jesus was born in a manger. And these events are taking place in a house, which would suggest that Joseph and Mary have kind of got themselves sorted out in Bethlehem. They've moved on from the manger, they've rented a house, they're now living in accommodation, and then these events begin to take place in the house. What we are celebrating at Christmas is the birth of our Lord and Savior into the world. That's who we worship. But the reality for us as Christians is we don't just worship that at Christmas, we worship it every single day of the year. The Christmas helps us to focus, but the whole year is where we're called to worship. And today I want to look at kind of two examples in the gospel of wise worship and unwise worship, if you could call it that. Part of our problem with the Christmas narrative is that it's got a whole lot of baggage. In our gospel today, we hear of the wise men. Full stop. That's all it says. It's not until the Middle Ages that these wise men get a name. The Gospels don't tell us their name. So lots of things have been added to the Christmas story, which sometimes help us, but oftentimes confuse us and confuse the story. And one of the greatest things that confuses over Christmas is the Christmas carols that we sing. They often are not helpful in terms of understanding what it is we're celebrating. Think of today's feast day. I know that later on in this Mass we're going to sing, "We three kings of Orient are, bearing gifts we've travelled afar." We all know that. It's so familiar to us. We probably wouldn't even have to put the words up in the wall. You would be able to sing it quite merrily. Now that carol was written by a man called John Henry Hopkins in 1857. So in terms of the history of the church, this was the day before yesterday. And guess what? It's wrong. For a start, we three kings, they weren't kings. They were wise men. And it says there's three of them. But that would be very, very unlikely. The reason that we kind of focus in on three is actually the three classifications of gifts that they bear. But we know from people at that time that people of the status of wise men did not travel as individuals or in small groups. They had huge, big caravans. You would know if the wise men were coming to town, because there would be lots of them, and there would be a whole backup team to support them. You know, these people were not kings. They were important. They were king makers. You know, so that whole image is wrong. And from Orient are. They didn't come from the Orient. They came from what we now call Iran. You know, so I've updated this hymn, and it would run something like this. We, huge entourage of astronomers from Iran, bearing gifts, we've traveled afar. Okay, it doesn't fit as well. I accept that. But it's more accurate. There were astronomers, there were wise men, mathematicians who study and advised leaders. They advised kings. They brought their wisdom. So we know that the wise men are advisors. They studies. They reflect on things. But how is it that these wise men are coming to Bethlehem to seek the King of the Jews? Well, we need to run right back into the Old Testament to the book of Daniel. And in the book of Daniel, if you can remember, King Nebuchadnezzar sees a disturbing image up on the wall. He sees a hand writing up on the wall. And he's disturbed by this, as rightly you would be. And he calls his wise men to try and interpret this dream, this vision. And they can't do it. So he calls this young boy Daniel, and Daniel can interpret the dream for him. And Daniel is then appointed the chief wise man. So this Jewish boy, who's in exile in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar, suddenly becomes the chief wise man to King Nebuchadnezzar. So he kind of runs the department. And what he does is he shares his wisdom with the other wise men. He also shares the Hebrew scriptures with them. So the wise men descending from him would have Daniel's wisdom. And they would have access to the Hebrew scriptures. And so they would study them. They would get to know them. And so when we meet up with the wise men that we're talking about in the gospel today, they are come, and the question that they have is, where is the infant King of the Jews? That's what they want to know, because they've studied it, they've studied the signs, and they now think that this is the opportune time for this infant King of the Jews to be born. They're not Jews themselves, but they know there's something of significance going on here. And they're guided to that point by a star. Now, you'll have seen all sorts of television programs trying to work out what this star was all about. You know, and they talk about, could it be a supernova? Could it be this, that, and the next thing? Totally irrelevant to the scriptures. For the scriptures, all the star is the equivalent of a GPS. It gets the wise men from Iran to Bethlehem. That's all that matters about the star. It's their GPS. And they get this audience with Herod. And Herod, we're told in the gospel, was perturbed. He wasn't perturbed. He was freaked. How come these wise men from Iran are coming and suddenly talking about the infant King of the Jews? Herod is really freaked by this. And the reason that he's freaked is because although Herod was a puppet king, the Romans allowed him to use the title King of the Jews. So Herod was threatened. You know, and what we see with Herod is somebody who's insecure. And insecure people are easily threatened. And Herod was hugely insecure. We know this because we know the history out with the Gospels of what Herod was like. Herod murdered his wife. He murdered his father-in-law. And he murdered his son because they were afraid that they were going to take his position. And we see in the gospel, after today's gospel, he is prepared to murder every child under the age of 2 because this infant king of the Jews is a threat to him. So Herod is threatened. He's making a bad choice when it goes on here. And he kind of says to the wise men, go on your way, and when you find him, let me know, because I too want to go and worship him. A most insincere call to worship that you've ever heard. And then there's another group of people who make really bad choices. So Herod goes to his wise men, the scribes and the learned people, and he says to them, well, where's the Christ to be born? And look at what happens in the gospel. They say immediately, Bethlehem. And then they quote the prophet Micah. So they've been studying the scriptures. They know the answer to Herod's question. But here's the rub. They're only 5 miles from Bethlehem. And the chief priests and the scribes don't bother to go and check it out. These are the leaders of the community, the religious leaders of the community, and they get this kind of sign that Micah is about to be fulfilled, and they don't even bother to check it out. It was a bad choice. So let's look at some of the good choices. The wise men come into the house, and the first thing that they do is kneel down and worship. That's the very first thing that they do. Before they do anything else, before they give gifts, they kneel down and worship. And that's important because God is more interested in your heart than he is interested in what you can give him. Because God knows deep down that if you give him your heart, everything else will follow. Everything else won't matter. And so then we hear the wise men offer gifts. And these gifts become really symbolic. They offer him, firstly, gold. Gold is a gift that you give to kings. Whenever you went to visit a king in the ancient days, you better have some gold. And so the wise men, in giving Jesus the gold, are saying something about his status. He is the King of the Jews. They are recognizing him as the King of the Jews. These foreigners, these outsiders, these Iranians are recognizing who Jesus really is. And we know that Mary and Joseph are poor. We know that. All we have to do is go back to what happened when they dedicated Jesus in the temple. And you have to give offerings of animals. And really what you should offer is a lamb. But if you're poor, you can offer a couple of pigeons. And that's what Mary and Joseph offer. They have no money. They are poor. But now they have the gift of this gold. And this gold gives Joseph the financial capability of taking Mary and Jesus out of danger and leading them to Egypt. They were migrants. We see migrants today who, often professional people who take their life savings and give them to these people who transport them across continents to bring them allegedly to safer lands. Joseph and Mary would have needed money to get to Egypt. And this gold enables them to do that. The next gift is frankincense, which is an expensive form of incense. And frankincense was reserved to the priests of Israel. So in giving Jesus this gift of frankincense, they're acknowledging that Jesus is the high priest. That's his status. That's who he is. And then the last gift is myrrh. Now, this is a really strange, weird gift to give to a baby or an infant. You know, it has two purposes. It could be used as an anesthetic. If you mixed myrrh with wine, then it kind of deadens the senses. And if you fast forward to the Passion of Jesus, when he's on the cross, at one point they offer him on a stick, it says vinegar. What it really was wine mixed with myrrh. They were trying to give Jesus an anesthetic to dull the pain, and he wouldn't take it. So that's one use of myrrh. But the other use of myrrh is it's used to embalm bodies. Now imagine you had an infant child, and a guest came to your door and offered gifts, and they gave you embalming fluid. How would that go down? Not very well. But they are pointing to something. They are pointing that this king, this high priest, is going to die and sacrifice himself for the salvation of all people. This is a huge gift that's been offered here. So today in this Epiphany, I think we're invited to ask of ourselves three questions. How do we make a good choice to worship or a bad choice to worship? Are we like Herod, following the star of ourselves? That the only thing that really matters is what I want, and nothing is going to interfere with my plans, not even God? Are we like the unwise Herod? Or are we like the religious leaders who follow the star of religion? They do all the right things, they jump through all the hoops, they have all the information, but they don't have a relationship with God. That their religion is external to who they are. That it's kind of out there, but it's not in here. They couldn't be bothered even to go to check this out. You know, or are we like the Magi who follow the star of Christ, who humble themselves before Christ and allow Christ to have the gift of our hearts? The end of the gospel ends curiously today. The wise men are given a dream to say, don't go back the way you came. Now, on the surface, that looks like go back a different way to avoid Herod. But I think there's something much deeper going on here. And what the gospel is saying to us is when we give our heart to Jesus, then we will leave in a different way from when we came.